Hello, my name is Joseph Opong. I am the Associate Vice Provost of the Toulouse Graduate School at the University of North Texas. And I would like to welcome you to our first virtual 3-minute thesis competition. All around the globe, universities are reacting to the current pandemic and moving their 3MT competitions online. UNT is no exception. We would have loved to welcome you to our beautiful campus, but we can't. However, we can still showcase our Tier 1 researchers. As one of the nation's largest universities, UNT offers 106 bachelor's, 88 master's, and 36 doctoral degree programs. Our university is ranked among the nation's top research universities. We are ranked 131 among the nation's top research universities according to the 2018 Carnegie Classification of Institutions of Higher Education. We're proud to be a very diverse Hispanic-serving institution with 38,000 students, including 8,000 graduate students. I would like to thank Phyllis Slocum and her graduate students, Seth Bailey and Tim Benson, for welcoming our contestants into the NTTV studio to record their 3-minute thesis presentations. It was important to me to maintain the spirit of presenting before a live audience, but COVID restrictions made that impossible. We chose to meet this element using the lights, sound checks, stage crew, and camera. I'm proud of our 10 contestants, and it is our pleasure to present to you the fall 2020 3-minute thesis doctoral competition. The first place winner will receive $1,000. The second place winner will receive $500. And we need your help to select the people's choice who will win $250. After you watch this video, please go to the UNT Toulouse Graduate School website and vote for your favorite contestant. I cannot stop without saying a big thank you to my assistant, Vesta Stacy. Without Vesta, none of this could have been possible. And so, Vesta, thank you for all you have done to make the fall 2020 3-minute thesis competition a reality. Now, over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As Dr. Opong mentioned, the 3MT competition is an interactive event that lets you vote for your favorite contestant. The 3MT is judged based on 2 broad criteria: comprehension and content, and engagement and communication. The first refers to the student's ability to explain their dissertation research in a clear and effective manner. The second deals with the stage presence and the contestant's ability to grab your attention. Our judges will be watching the contestants and scoring them on a scale of from 1 to 10. Our first place category winner will take home $1,000. The runner-up will receive $500, and your vote will decide the People's Choice winner for $250. With that, I will take a moment to introduce our judges that have generously volunteered their time today. Mr. Emilio Gonzalez, Financial Advisor for RFG Wealth Management. Mr. Ryan Hambach, Operations Director for Fractal Designs. And Mike Lands, Consulting Engineer. Now it is time to invite our first finalist to the stage. First up is Jabin Shamji. Jabin, please take the stage.
The topic of my dissertation is perspective taking and its mechanism. I grew up in a big household with grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins. There was immense social support, but misunderstandings occurred frequently. As a child, hiding behind my mom, I always wondered and asked, why do people argue and blame each other? Here is a fact. An individual spends 5 to 8 minutes in small talk. But in most social situations, we struggle to understand others' viewpoint. Perspective taking is that ability that is required in almost every healthy interpersonal relationship. So for example, consider this black and white image. What do you see? Do you see a bird or a bunny? Why do you think that is? Our views and opinion change, not only from a physical and visual state, but also from a mental state as well. There are different kinds of perspectives: how I think about myself, how I think about others, and what I believe others think about me. When we are talking about perspective taking, we are referring to the processes through which we can hold back what we think we know about a given situation. By doing that, we are less reactive and more attuned to understand what the other person is trying to think and say. Perspective taking does not mean that we agree, but we acknowledge that we all have unique perspectives and viewpoints. In a given situation, we process what is being said based on our thinking capacity, and it gets even more complicated when we are also thinking what the other person is thinking about us. My dissertation would be exploring these very complexities of perspective taking using stories that involve 2 or more characters, and how it varies from more basic to most complex thinking processes using computerized tasks. These are the building blocks that sets the foundation for mature perspective taking. The significance of perspective taking cannot be emphasized more in this political environment and for social justice advocacy. In closing, I want to emphasize that there are different viewpoints and different perspectives to see this world. Perspective taking improves your ability to connect, communicate, and empathize. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jabin. Our next presenter is Safan Nahir. Her department is the College of Science, Biochemistry, and Molecular Biology. The title of her 3MT presentation is On the Way to Manage Diabetes. Safan, please take the stage.
I want you to meet my dad, who is sitting on a wheelchair due to a stroke occurred 2 years back as a consequence of diabetes. 2 of his younger brothers and his mom also died of stroke related to diabetes at a very young age. What if I told you this is not only the reality of my dad's family, but also the reality of 10.5% American population? According to CDC, 34.2 million Americans have diabetes. What are the risk factors for diabetes? In addition to genetic factors and sedentary lifestyle, added sugar in diet can also contribute to diabetes. Diabetes is one of the leading causes of death, whereas heart disease is the main leading cause of death. According to study, 68% diabetic patients get affected by heart disease. In 2020, COVID-19 became 3rd leading cause of death, and study says 30% COVID-19 death occurred in people with diabetes. As all of you know, hyperglycemia is a metabolic syndrome associated with diabetes where blood glucose level rises and induces human health issues. In my research, I am looking at the impact of elevated glucose level by using C. elegans as a model for hyperglycemia. C. elegans is a cute little worm, 1 millimeter in size. When we feed them sugar, the whole worm glucose concentration increases and induces negative consequences. For examples, short lifespan, developmental delay, accumulation of fat, increased sensitivity to stress. Glucose also induces stress responses and impacts fertility in C. elegans. I identified a mutant which is resistant to some of these negative consequences and has altered insulin receptor. In this mutant animal, a gene regulatory protein enters into the nucleus and regulates a set of genes to reduce the negative consequences generated by elevated glucose level. In normal animal, this gene regulatory protein sits inactively, like a lazy team manager who usually sits at home, only goes to office to manage his team members when his boss is supposed to come. Similar pathway exists in human as well. Further understanding of this pathway will help us determine the ways to reduce the negative consequences and the number of deaths caused by diabetes. It is too late for my dad to get the benefit of my research. It may not be too late for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Safan. Our next presenter is Jessica Shrestha. Her department is the College of Science Biology. The title of her 3MT presentation is A Tale of Two Receptors. Jessica, please take the stage.
What if someone here suddenly loses consciousness, slips and falls, and starts shaking? We panic, try our best to regain his consciousness. But have we thought of the person who experienced that just now? Living with epilepsy, the person is often self-conscious and lives with a fear. Fear of having seizure in public, fear of injury, fear of losing one's job. But Theodore Roosevelt did not let his epilepsy stop him, and neither should anyone. Yes, the 26th President of the United States was suffering from epileptic seizure. 50 million people worldwide have epilepsy, making it one of the most common neurological diseases. When the brain is firing off too many impulses at the same time, it gives rise to an electrical storm. That's when seizure begins. My study focuses on two receptors whose regulation affects seizure activity. Consider two mice and both of them have seizure. Looking at their behavior, we find that one of them has increased seizure compared to the other. The only difference between these two receptors is the one that increased seizure is missing a receptor. This tells us that this missing receptor has an important role in protecting the mice against seizure. Further, we wanted to explore their brains, so we colored different receptors with different color markers. Surprisingly, we saw an increased expression of another receptor. We thought even this receptor could be responsible to cause seizure. But how does a cell even know that in the absence of one receptor, it needs to express the other? To answer, we looked inside a brain of a normal mouse. A very nice gradient is observed between these two receptors. As you go from one region of the brain to another, you see more of one and the less of other. Similar to each hill having its own king who has the ability to suppress its opponent, each brain region has its receptor as the king who has the ability to suppress its opponent receptor. And when this king is knocked off, the opponent rules the hill. This competition between the two receptors is fascinating to me. Unlike COVID-19, epilepsy has been around us for thousands of years, so we do have treatments to suppress seizure. But none of the FDA-approved drug works as the receptors of my interest. Therefore, my study lays a foundation for future exploration that targeting these two receptors could be a new avenue of treatment for epilepsy. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Believe you can, and you're halfway there." I believe in the research I am doing through which I want those 50 million people to know that scientists are working for you to lessen your fear, and I'm one of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Our next presenter is Sanket Boyata. His department is the College of Engineering, Materials Science Engineering. The title of his 3MT presentation is Charge Once a Week. Sanket, please take the stage.
Hello everyone. Today I have a simple question for all of you. Is your life filled up with intense amount of charging? Imagine charging your cell phone inside your house, inside your apartment, or a car, or office. It is so satisfying, especially to charge your cell phone when your battery runs down to 3%, isn't it? Now, even if you find a right charging spot to charge your cell phone, what if you don't have electricity to charge one? Yes, there exists a world where people face a severe electricity crisis, where they have power outages. How helpless our life would be if we are to exist in this situation of emergency and we cannot call for any help. The problem is, lithium-ion batteries inside your cell phone has such a limited capacity that it can only last for a day or two. However, with right technology, we can increase this capacity up to 7 days without any charging. Yes, let me introduce you to the next generation lithium-sulfur batteries, whose capacity is about 7 to 8 times higher than that of traditional lithium-ion batteries. However, every battery or every technology has its own drawbacks. The problem with lithium-sulfur battery is it has poor reaction kinetics. Because of this, we cannot use this battery for actual application. However, thanks to me and my knowledge in materials that I gained from UNT, that I have developed a nano catalyst. It is so efficient that it can solve all the problems inside the lithium sulfur battery without any issues. Yes, using nanotechnology, I developed this nano catalyst which is super thin, super light in weight, so efficient and cost effective that it increased the capacity of lithium sulfur battery up to 7 times higher than that of traditional lithium ion batteries. 7 times higher. This means is if you use my battery inside your cell phone, your cell phones will last longer than 7 days without need of charging. The hidden secret is the way materials arrange themselves inside this catalyst is so unique that the capacity of the battery is improved along with its stability. That means my battery is stable up to 5 years without any issue. I believe that every technology has its true value when it gets into actual market. I take this valuable responsibility to work along with the companies and bring this technology into the market so that you can stay charged without any issue more than 7 days. Now I am mean green, but I also mean your batteries to stay green. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanket. Our next presenter is Tatiana Kucher. Her department is the College of Information Learning Technologies. The title of her 3MT presentation is Virtual Reality to the Rescue During the Pandemic. Tatiana, please take the stage.
Humans are social creatures. We all go through our lives building connections with other people. Sadly, socialization with our friends and families is becoming more difficult in the face of the pandemic. I haven't been able to visit my family in Ukraine for over 1.5 years, and honestly, I don't know when I will. Your grandma, who may be in a retirement home, is unable to see her grandkids and is suffering from loneliness. There are many families who may live in the same city yet unable to see each other for months. This pandemic has forced many of us to sacrifice our social connection. But what was the price of this sacrifice? Researchers found that prolonged social isolation leads to depression, anxiety, loneliness, and mental disorders. Is there anything we can do? To find the answer, I turned to modern technologies, specifically to immersive virtual reality. Virtual communications like Zoom and telehealth are already becoming more common. But virtual reality offers a whole new level of connection achieved through shared experiences that go beyond conversation, something we cannot do with Zoom. Just imagine, by simply wearing your VR goggles, you were immediately transferred to a bowling alley, a tennis court, a movie theater, or even a karaoke bar where you can spend time with your friends and make new ones. This technology is already here, but here's the problem. Because VR technology is so novel, very few people are actually using it, leaving its potential benefits undiscovered. Therefore, we don't know if VR can help us battle social isolation. Yet, this is where my research comes in. I will interview over 200 VR set owners and ask them how their social lives have been affected by the pandemic and whether VR has become an aid in this complicated process. I will ask them how they use VR to connect with other people and whether it has led to improvements in their social lives in the face of the pandemic. That's my contribution, and it is important because it will uncover and spread awareness of previously unknown benefits of VR and potentially improve our quality of life. We will also know how we can make this technology better, which will lead to more important research and more exciting VR discoveries. That's why tomorrow your grandma will not have to be isolated from her family. She will still be able to play with her grandkids, bowl with her friends, and lead a happy life. And while I may not be physically present with my family, we will still be able to nurture our strong social connections in the virtual world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Our next presenter is Margaret Norris. Her department is the College of Education, Curriculum and Instruction. The title of her 3MT presentation is The Impact of Culturally Responsive Pedagogy on the Academic Achievement of Black Indian People of Color Students in STEM Courses. Margaret, please take the stage.
Imagine, if you will, that you are designing a garden. You decide to include a variety of plants in this garden, including a cactus, a rose bush, and an evergreen shrub. Based on your research, you know that each of these plants are going to require a different amount of water and sunlight in order to thrive. And so naturally, you consider this information as you determine where to position each plant within the garden and as you create a watering schedule. You know that a one-size-fits-all gardening approach is not going to be appropriate if you really want these plants to flourish, but you recognize the individual beauty that each of these plants offer, and so you're happy to accommodate for their needs. Additionally, you don't fault the plants for having these differences, nor do you view these differences in needs as being a deficit of the plant. Unfortunately, many of our students of color are not afforded this same mindful approach in their science, technology, engineering, or mathematics courses, otherwise known as STEM. In 2018, it was reported that less than 20% of the workforce in the STEM field consisted of individuals of color. Now, this is a huge problem because in the coming years, it is expected that occupations and careers in the STEM field will lead the way in terms of job growth and job need. This underrepresentation emphasizes the fact that we are continually underserving our students of color in terms of STEM instruction at the high school level. The thing is that culture plays a really critical role in learning, and it needs to play a really critical role in STEM instruction. We know that culturally responsive pedagogy can be a very effective tool in helping teachers to be able to create that really important connection between STEM classroom instruction and student cultures. But it's not effective if these teachers are not willing or able to confront their hidden biases. And it's not effective if schools are not engaged in comprehensive efforts to create an anti-racist school culture. Therefore, my study is looking at the impact of culturally responsive pedagogy professional development on the ability of STEM teachers to develop a cultural consciousness about themselves and about others, as well as their ability to make these connections between the classroom STEM instruction and their students' cultures. The study will also look at that overarching impact of this intentional connection on the academic success of students of color in STEM courses. My hope is that the results of this study will be able to help inform best practices for instructional leaders as they work with teachers to develop a cultural pedagogy that involves both a mindset and practice to ensure that all students are afforded equitable opportunities to prepare for and pursue whatever career pathway they may choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Our next presenter is Cheng-Yuan Jiang. His department is the College of Engineering, Computer Science Engineering. The title of his 3MT presentation is Facilitating Deep Learning with Salient Information for Visual Recognition. Cheng-Yuan, please take the stage.
Vision is important. It accounts about 80% information we receive from the world. In recent years, deep learning has emerged as revolutionary tools for many vision tasks, such as image classification, object detection, and new applications such as self-driving. Many L people would like that become reality, including my uncle, because it's difficult for him to see clearly to drive to stores and hospital. However, there's still some challenges prevent that from happening. First, label data are limited. The famous self-driving dataset Cityscapes only have 2,700 images for training and took about 1.5 hours to label a single image at pixel level. Second, reliability. This system automatically learns from the data, working like a black box, and we have no control whether the decision is reasonable or not. Researchers have investigated the famous GoogleNet on a failure case that Husky was misclassified as wolf. It turned out that their decision was based on the snow around the object, not the object itself. They also found that the correct decision for wolf actually used snow as the primary reason. This wrong logic may be very dangerous when a system interacting with the real world. In 2016, Tesla had the first death report in the US when the system failed to recognize a white truck across a highway and hit the truck at full speed. A similar case happened 3 years later in 2019. Improvement on deep learning system not only means numbers, but life. I have discovered that humans do not treat information equally, and salient information is very helpful for the learning and decision-making process. And I have developed modules to generate salient information from each level and feed that information to the system. It forces the system to consider information such as border, shapes, and much more to get closer to the way humans are doing. Initial results demonstrate that we improved the state-of-the-art model on both small and large datasets. In the future, you may not be surprised to see that the application you are using have this technology inside. It brings you more accuracy, more reliability, and more confidence for you to use.
Thank you, Cheng Yuan. Our next presenter is Levanya Rakakonda. Her department is the College of Engineering, Computer Science Engineering. The title of her 3MT presentation is MyLog, Human Stress Detection and Control Using Internet of Medical Things. Levanya, please take the stage.
I think it is safe to say that every individual experiences stress. It can either be good stress or bad stress, but the impact of stress on the human body can only be determined by the time period the human has actually spent under stress. In order to understand more about stress, first let's understand what is stress. Stress can be known as any physical response for an inconvenient or an awkward situation, which can also be known as a stressor. So depending upon the time classification, stress is again classified into acute or chronic stress. Prolonged exposure of chronic stress can lead to many diseases including diabetes, obesity, cancer, etc. So what happens when a person is stressed? Every human body has a stress response system which can either be healthy or unhealthy. A healthy response system starts from the baseline, goes up when the person is stressed, and then comes back to the baseline, maintaining its system. While an unhealthy response system starts at the baseline, goes up, but does not come back to the baseline because the human body habituates to live under stress. So the main problem of my research is how do we monitor the stress response system inside the human body, or how do we know if we have a healthy or an unhealthy response system? In order to address this problem, I have proposed various variables and non-variables which continuously monitor the stress levels using various physiological and psychological parameters. I have also provided control remedies for the user at the user end so that the user can get control over his body. Along with this control remedies, I have also provided a detailed analysis report in relationship with the parameters to stress for the user to understand the various fluctuations inside the body happening during the stressors. Considering the forgetful natures of the human, I have proposed fully automated, secured systems which monitor the fluctuations inside the body without having the user to enter any information. I think it is safe to say that my research allows the individuals to have a healthy and beautiful life inside and out. Thank you.
Thank you, Levanya. Our next presenter is Robert Arroyo. His department is the College of Information Science. The title of his 3MT presentation is Optimizing Clinical Trial Design for Success. Robert, please take the stage.
Hi, I would like to first invite you to close your eyes and imagine taking your grandmother or grandfather to the doctor's office. And the reason for this visit is because their treatment no longer works. Now, this could be a treatment for cancer, it could be a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, heck, it could be a treatment for COVID-19 treatment. But when you get to the doctor's office, the doctor tells you they've tried all possible treatments and that there's no more options. So, no more options. Now, that's something that nobody ever wants to hear in regards to the care for their loved one. And you can open your eyes if you haven't already done so. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that my project aims to change that phrase, no more options, into several more options. But before I tell you how I'll do that, let's take a walk and see how drugs even make their way into the doctor's office. So medicinal drugs, before they're even made publicly available, have to be tested on humans in what is known as a clinical trial. Now, the clinical trial can be broken down into four phases. The first phase tests whether the drug is safe. The second phase tests to see if the drug works. And the third phase confirms the first two phases. And then the fourth phase is when the drug gets the stamp of approval and then it gets sent to become publicly available. Now, here's the thing. Of all the drugs that make it into the clinical trial, fewer than 10% will make its way to the fourth phase. And there's several reasons why, but that's outside the scope of my talk right now. And here's what I would like you to know, is that the drugs that do make it to the fourth phase takes 10 to 15 years to do so. And they're tailored to the common person that fit the criteria that's matched to phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And so in other words, the traditional clinical trial approach doesn't address the individual differences that we share in and amongst each other. Now, my project aims to change phase 3, and by using real-world data. Now, real-world data involves things like electronic health records, information from electronic wearables, behavioral risk patterns, and essentially anything that's not collected by the traditional clinical trial approach. But I will then use this data to identify characteristics that respond or don't respond to a particular drug. I'll then use sophisticated machine learning techniques to identify the patient populations that do and don't respond, and also to reduce the time spent in phase 3. And so in this era of new diseases such as COVID-19, I leave you with this question. Would you rather have fewer options for fewer people or several options for several different kinds of people? And who knows, maybe next time when you do visit the office, the doctor's office, and you ask for other possible treatments, you'll hear that there's several other options. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Our next presenter is Pranathi Annamala. Her department is the College of Information Learning Technologies. The title of her 3MT presentation is The Relationship Between Personal Wearable Devices and Motivation to Exercise in Older Adults. Pranathi, please take the stage.
Kathy is my 7-year-old neighbor, and she seemed to be in perfect health until her 5-year-old grandson, Nathan, came to visit her over a weekend. I saw her constantly catch her breath as she chased him around the house. She was really young at heart, but her body was getting old. When we're younger, the lack of exercise makes us feel we're less healthy. But as we get older, like my friend Kathy, it just decreases our quality of life. We all know about Fitness Tracker. They've been here a long time, and it is a no-brainer that we need exercise to maintain our health. But how many of us actually exercise when we're younger, much less when we get older? So fitness trackers are a way that can help older adults include their daily activities and exercise to the point that they can build a habit to strengthen their muscles. And also the tracker intervenes if it observes a sedentary behavior and makes the user accountable to be mobile. My research has 2 main areas which talk about motivation to wear a tracker. One being competition, and the second being the habit pool. In my first study, I conducted at UNT, where a senior professor was introduced to a Fitbit, and I saw a linear trend in his progress of activity when 2 other professors joined the study. So he was clearly competitive, and then the only way that he would increase his physical exercise was when there was a challenge for him. So fitness trackers can seamlessly facilitate competition and provide challenges for users and help them reach their goals. But not everybody is competitive. So I'm conducting a 9-week study among seniors in Denton that tests the habit formation rule of reminders and positive reinforcements via fitness trackers to improve their exercise. And the initial results of my study show that with the perceived notion of health and increase the willingness to wear a fitness tracker can increase their interest in exercise and move towards their health and well-being. The reason I talked about Kathy is that if she had a fitness tracker, she would have been able to spend more quality time with her grandson and be more self-aware of her physical capacity and maybe just move towards a better quality of life. My research is an empirical proof that fitness trackers are facilitators for sustained interest in physical activity, and they're definitely a great present for your parents. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranathi. Now that all of our contestants have presented, please take a moment to visit the UNT Toulouse Graduate School's website and cast your vote for the People's Choice. This concludes the first session of the 2020 Fall 3MT competition.